Thank you for joining me today on this session. And thanks to Sarah for actually organizing this and hosting me and having me, but also to all of you who are actually interested in hearing me speak. My name is Agnius. And well, yeah, I'm here basically to tell you about how to handle errors in Power Automate Cloud Flows the proper way. Before we go on with that, I'll just share a quick intro on myself. So, yeah, I run an agency that specializes in process improvement and automation. So, Power Automate is my, the thing I earn my living on. I'm fairly knowledgeable about it, and well, Power Automate, both cloud and desktop, RPA in general. Since recently, I'm a Microsoft MVP specifically for the tech area in Power Automate. And well, I'm also kind of knowledgeable about certain alcoholic beverages. And the reason I mentioned that, you'll learn of that in a minute. There is a reason why I mentioned that. Anyway. As mentioned, the session today is focused on error handling in Power Automate Cloud. The agenda is pretty straightforward. I'll share a few slides where I take you through the basics. We'll explain the concepts, and then I'll switch to a demo afterwards where I show you how to actually do that in practice. And then afterwards, I'll maybe do a quick summary, and we'll have some time for Q&A, hopefully. Right, so the reason why I talk about error handling is, well, because it's important. Regardless of how much time and effort you actually put into your flows, unexpected things can and will eventually happen. And what we don't really want is those unexpected things to let all hell break loose in our enterprise environments, obviously. So we need to handle errors. We need to handle them in some way so that they don't break our environments. However, since Power Automate is a low-code, no-code tool that is marketed quite heavily towards citizen developers with no prior experience and background in IT, there's lots and lots of users out there who simply do not know how to handle errors or that they need to do it in the first place. And unfortunately, Power Automate's cloud flows, nor do actually desktop flows, they don't come with any error handling framework out of the box. It needs to be implemented by the developer. There's also no native way for actually reporting or notifying users when a flow fails. Well, there are some automated emails. You just, it just says that your flow has failed, but that's pretty much all there is. And then if the flows actually run on a service account, for example, those emails are basically useless. There's also no single template available or something like that we could use. But there are some recommended best practices, and they're not all equally good. So, I'm here to share my views on what actually works best. Now, the not very convenient or obvious thing about handling errors in cloud flows is that it all relies on the so-called run after settings that are actually applied on the following action in your flow rather than the action that you want to handle. And that's an issue in my case. Well, at least not necessarily an issue, but something I don't really like about it. It's not very, convenient, not very obvious to understand. And it also means that we need extra actions to handle each exception that we actually want to handle, as well as create parallel branches or try catch finally structures to be able to actually continue the flow in one way or another after an exception has actually happened. Now, once we actually figure that out, there are essentially three ways in which we could handle errors. we can do, the first one is what we all do initially when we start, is no error handling, essentially meaning that our flows will fail on the first error. Obviously not recommended. We don't want that. Don't do that. A slightly better approach is the so-called action level error handling, where we actually handle each individual action separately. So we build rules for every action in the flow. This means that at least errors will actually be handled. So it's better than having no error handling. But since, as mentioned previously, we need to add extra action for each error we handle, it's going to easily turn even the simplest flows into large and overly complex and difficult to understand constructs that we don't really want. So the recommended approach is using scopes to group actions and then applying the error rules to the entire scope. This makes flows easier, cleaner, much simpler to implement. Now, when we actually handle errors, we don't really just want to kind of handle it and go on with the next action. We usually also want to get the details of the error to figure out what caused the error, maybe log it somehow or notify someone. We can use a couple of expressions to actually do that, depending on what we handle. So if for whatever reason we went with the action level error handling approach, we could use the actions expression, which will just return the actual outputs of the action that we're handling. Or if we take the recommended approach and use scopes, we can use the result expression that will return the outputs of the entire container scope. Both of these will actually result in a JSON object similar to the one shown in here, but the schemas will vary depending on what actions and containers we're actually handling. Result actually, well, the reason I mentioned the word containers is because result actually works on other containers, such as conditions and loops. So a container is actually an action that can contain actions inside of it. So conditions, loops, and scopes are the containers in Power Automate Cloud Flows. However, there are at least 4 different schemas for the output that we can get. This applies to both of the expressions because, well, the outputs of the result expression will still depend on the action that actually failed within the container we handled. So it will return the same thing, but just within an array. It will also return the same kind of an object as the actions expression, but within a list of objects for each of the actions inside the container. So what this means is that regardless of the approach we take, it will still be quite tricky to handle all exceptions properly. A big shout out here goes to David Wyatt for actually finding 3 of these, the first 3. However, it actually seems like these can in fact change, because I actually found a 4th type myself, but could not reproduce type 3, as the create item action under the SharePoint connector would actually result in type 4 for me when I forced it to fail. So this was what David actually suggested that should be returned on create item, but I actually got the type 4. So it might actually change. It might have changed since he published this article on his blog, or it might not really be static. Right. Now, as mentioned, using scopes is obviously the recommended approach. This should be obvious by now, but there are also a couple of things to note about it too, which make it even less fun. Now, first of all, it only works properly when there are no nesting of containers in your scopes. So as mentioned, containers are conditions and loops as well. So what this means is that if you want to have a condition within your scope, you will need a different schema. because a condition is a container itself. And so you'll need to modify the schema. But if the same schema that you will apply to the condition will not work for all of the other actions inside your scope that are outside of the condition, because they're in the first level of the containers, whereas whatever is inside the condition are in the second level of the containers. And then that needs a different schema. On top of that, as if that wasn't fun enough already, loops, which are also containers, have a completely different schema from both conditions and scopes. So the recommendation here is obviously to try and use as few containers as possible if you're using scopes for handling errors, that is. Now, in the past, I used to go with the create HTML table action and to actually get the details of my errors. And I would just, convert the outputs of the result expression to a pretty table that I could then send via email to a recipient or something like that. But again, this never worked with nested containers, such as loops and conditions inside my scopes. And it also didn't really work that well with actions that have different schemas either. And then I kind of realized that, well, I don't really need a table when it's, with a single row, because why? I would usually build my flows in a way where there can only be a single error, because as soon as there is an error, further actions are actually skipped and the actual handling kicks in. And then I get the error message and I send it out or log it somewhere. So I don't really need a table for that. Instead, I could just get it as a string, and that would usually be enough. And it's much easier to do. It can be done relatively easily using the coalesce expression in combination with the different schemas, because this expression is specifically used to return the first non-null value out of everything that you push to it. So what we essentially need to do is we build the coalesce expression with all of the schemas, and I'll actually show you the full expression later on in the slides, but this is just as much as I could actually fit into a note on an action. But essentially, the coalesce expression would then have all of the different schemas inside of it. And then, with the result expression actually handling the schema, but then I would also need to apply a bit of sorting to only get the failed actions and then pick up the first item in there. And let me explain that a bit. The result expression will return the outputs of all actions inside your container, meaning that it will also return the outputs of all successful actions that actually ran before the actual error happened. So if there were several actions that succeeded and then one that actually failed, all of the outputs will actually be returned. So what we need to do first is sort that and sort it by status, so that the first item in the outputs of result is the failed action. And then we get it using an index, and then we parse it using the actual schema that we expect the error message to be in. We do the same thing with all four schemas, and then the one that actually doesn't return a null value, meaning that the one that actually captures the error message, will be the one that coalesce returns. And that's essentially the idea behind it. So this can then be expanded to as many schemas as we find, if we find any further in the future for some reason. Right, so I think I'm stepping into deep waters here by now, so it's time to show you what it looks like in practice. To make it easier to understand, it really does sound a lot more complex on a slideshow than it is when you actually use it in a flow. So I'll just find my browser. Right, there we go. Now, first of all, a bit of context behind the flows. I really hate to build flows that do nothing, even if it's a demo of a generic topic such as error handling. I would still like to add a bit of a personal touch to it. So for this specific purpose, I built a few flows that kind of serves the recent passion of mine, which is making cocktails. So I've got a few recipes for cocktails that I like, that I've tried making, or some that I haven't tried but would like to try in the near future. And I've pushed them to a SharePoint list, like this one here. And yeah, well, it's gotten quite long by now, actually. And I've got them here with, the name, the actual preparation, the ingredients, some tags, and whether or not I've tried it actually, and so on. And then I've got a separate list called ingredients over here. That's just the list of all of the ingredients I would need to make all of those cocktails, and whether or not I actually have them available at home, meaning that I can actually use it in a cocktail. And yeah, I've tried making this as simple and straightforward as possible for the purpose of the demo, but the cocktail list actually has a lookup field for the ingredients in here so that I can actually check whether or not I have all of the ingredients to make a specific cocktail when I target it. Right, so that's the context behind it. And then I've built a few flows. I've got a solution in Power Automate that input with a few, actually 4 different flows that essentially do very similar things, but using different types of exception handling and different constructs so that I can demo them to you. I've already built them. I won't be building them here because if I did, this wouldn't be a session. This would be more of a full day workshop. But I'll show you what they are and how they work. Right, so the most popular approach that you may have heard of is the so-called try, catch, and finally, also known as try, catch, and continue, or something similar. It comes from the software programming background in some programming languages where it's actually called that way. Now, the idea of this approach is to have the main actions of your flow in a try scope, like this. And then have a catch scope that would handle any exceptions that happen in try. And finally, have a finally scope and a group of actions that would run regardless of whether there was an exception or not. So in my case, this would just generate a recommendation on a cocktail. Or actually, it would pull all of my favorite cocktails and just get all of their names and then send me an email at the end if it actually succeeded, whereas the catch would handle any errors. Right. So the right way, the correct way to actually set something like this up is, again, by using the configure run after settings. And yeah, so we would need to set up catch to only run if try has either failed or timed out, meaning it doesn't actually run if try succeeds. And then have the finally scope run if catch either succeeds or is skipped. Because if there is an exception in try, catch will kick in, hopefully succeed. And then, we still want finally to run. If there is no exception in try, meaning that it runs successfully, catch is actually skipped. And then we want to finally to run anyway. So if I were to run this, what I would get, in this case, it will actually succeed. I'll get an email with some recommendations. Just check, where is my mailbox? Right. There we go. It recommends me making some of my favorite cocktails, right? Now, this is okay-ish, but I personally do not like this approach. And there are a few reasons for that. First of all, I haven't personally found that many cases where I would actually want to continue regardless of an error. Actually, I haven't found any cases like that in the past. I assume some of you may have found some, but I haven't. It just doesn't make sense. In most cases, I would want different steps to be taken depending on whether there was an error or not, or just stop if there is an error. In addition to that, it's usually quite tricky to continue, and it requires some advanced expressions to make the finally scope actually succeed. In this case, I need to send an email, right? But this email actually depends on the dynamic content out of these actions, specifically the select action. So if either the get items or the select fails, we don't have the dynamic content. And then if I don't handle the possibility of it not being there, the send email will also fail. So I need to build in a large expression, checking whether an error message variable is empty, so that I can handle the possibility of these actions actually failing in here, which adds to the complexity of it all, really. And it's also possible that this action still fails anyway, which would technically mean that if we really wanted to be safe, we would need to put in some extra error handling on top of this, which kind of defeats the purpose of having it in a finally scope after the catch. And finally, I would usually want a failed flow to actually terminate as failed, so that I can see it in my flow run history that it has actually failed instead of completing successfully. Now, if we handle errors, and assuming that the error handling in here doesn't actually fail, it will complete as successful, regardless of the fact that there was an error in here. And I don't personally like that. I would want to be able to easily see in my flow run history which of the flows have actually failed. But that's quite tricky to implement in this scenario, because I would need to put the terminate action in finally, because if I terminate here, finally doesn't run at all. So I would need to put that in here somewhere. And then I would also need to add extra logic to check whether or not there was an exception, to just be able to terminate properly. Again, defeats the purpose of having finally. So I don't really like this approach, and I'll show you a few better approaches, but I thought I would still need to describe this and explain why it's not the best approach, in my opinion. But there are also a few more things I want to show you in this flow that are really generic to all of the approaches and will be actually the same in all of the following flows that I'll show you. So first of all, it's the expression to capture the error message. As mentioned, that's the coalesce expression, and that's probably this action is probably the one I used for the screenshot anyway. So that's a relatively large expression, but it's quite straightforward to just copy and paste it. And as mentioned, it has it's sorting the results by status, picking up the first item, and then coalesce is handling so that it's actually returning the first null value. Right, and yeah, well, sorry about this actually looking like this on the classic designer. Ironically, I can't even enable the new designer on this one when I'm in Lithuania, but apparently when I was in Germany a couple of weeks ago delivering the same session in a summit, it actually did turn on the new designer for me by default, because I was on a German IP address. Apparently, it just kind of discriminates based on the location. Anyway, so I can't really show this to you in a modern designer, which might look a bit nicer. But yeah, so that's the idea. Then when I've actually captured the expression, I will usually send myself an email. That's just my choice of what I want to do. You can obviously push this to whatever you want. You could update a queue item or a SharePoint list item, or push an entry into a Dataverse table, or whatever other logging functionality you want to use. I just used an email because I also wanted to demonstrate something else, which makes more sense in an email. And that's a flow run URL. So that's a link to the specific flow run that has actually happened. And the great thing about this flow run URL is the fact that, first of all, it survives a much longer, well, it has a much longer retention span than what you can actually see in your flow run history. Survives at least much longer than the last 100 runs. And it's also accessible to environment admins without needing to share the flow with them. So it's a great way to actually send a notification to someone who's responsible for the environment, for example, on something that's failed. And the expression needed to generate that flow run URL is over here. That's pretty straightforward. It's just a concat expression with generic Power Automate URL and then some workflow values that are dynamic. But yeah, I'll share this expression as well in the slides later on. Right, and so if I force this to fail, for example, by doing something like this, adding a column that doesn't exist in this list because available is a column in the ingredients list and not the cocktails list, what will happen is it will take a while to save and then it will run. Right, I get a new email that says, right, well, there's one that says it failed to retrieve cocktail recommendations. That's because finally kicked in anyway, regardless of the expression of the exception, even though it did actually fail. So yeah, that's just a body I built in. And here's the actual error message. So I got the error message pretty detailed over here, everything that we would see in the flow run as well. And I got the URL. So if I were to copy this and go on in here and just push that, this will take me to the flow run, which again is flagged as having completed successfully, which is the thing I hate the most about this approach anyway. Right, so let's get back to this and I'll just fix this. And now the approach that I would usually prefer is a simplified version of this. I call it basic, but it's essentially almost the same except for not having the finally scope. So the way this works is that we have one scope for the actual actions that we want to run. I call it main in this case, but it could also be just try and catch without the finally. And yeah, I've got the same actions in here. Actually, I think maybe the filter is also the same. So this is exactly the same. The only difference is the fact that I've moved the email into the main scope, and now I don't need the finally scope. What this means is that I can use a simpler expression in here so that I don't really need to check whether or not the previous actions failed. So that's making my life a little easier. I still went with a relatively complex expression because there's a possibility of actually not having anything to return, but yeah, it's still slightly easier, slightly less of a complex expression in there. And then the more important thing in here is the exception scope, which is again very similar to what I had in the previous case, but with the actual terminate action. So I can now terminate as failed, and this will, and I also push the error message over here. So if I were to force this one to, because if this ran successfully, I'd just get the same recommendations as previously, but if I'm forcing this to fail, and run it, and you can actually also see that I've actually ran a few tests and some of them are actually flagged as failed. So that's the major difference. At least I can see that some of them have actually failed in the past. Right, so this one has finished. It has actually failed, and I can see that it's failed because it ran the terminate action. And I only received one email in this case with the that says the flow has failed. The error message is the same. I don't get the irrelevant recommendations email that says they can't really recommend anything to me anyway. So that's more straightforward, easier to read, simpler to build. Right. And then This usually works for very simple flows, but you could also have a slightly more complex flow where you might want to have some different paths taken, or some actions handled slightly differently than the rest. In that case, the recommended approach is using parallel branches, where we would have, for example, in this case, we have two different steps, right? We have one scope that has some actions inside it. And then if it fails, we run the exception over here. If it succeeds, we have another scope that runs a few more actions, and then we have an exception scope for that one. And we can go on as many as we like, depending on the complexity of and the business logic of the specific flow. Now, this specific flow in this case actually does a slightly different thing. It gets all of the cocktails and filters them out so that I get only those that I haven't tried. So that's a different recommendation. Instead of recommending favorites, it recommends me to do something new. And then I'm processing the cocktail, meaning I'm actually generating a random number to get just one of those. And then I'm getting the ingredients, checking whether or not I have all of them, and then sending myself a recommendation on whether I can actually make the cocktail. Right. So that's a slightly longer flow. Technically, I don't really need to handle those actions differently in any way. But if, for example, you had a case where you need to pick up a work item, for example, from a queue or from a SharePoint list or whatever, and then you need to process it, then obviously, if your flow fails to pick it up, then you have one kind of exception handling where you just, notify someone that, yeah, I failed to pick up a work item. I couldn't pick up the work item I needed to process. And so I don't have an ID of it or something. But then if I actually succeed to pick up the work item and move on further down the road, and I try to process the work item, but I cannot complete the transaction, whatever it is, I already have the ID of the work item, so I can actually update it, for example, with a failed status or something. So I could have a different exception steps in here. Now, since I'm not really writing anything into my cocktail tracker, my exceptions are actually exactly the same in both cases. But the reasoning behind this approach is that you use it when you want different handling for different steps in your flow. So this one is just set up to only run when get cocktails actually fails or times out, whereas process cocktail will only run by default when get cocktails is successful. That runs if it fails, then this is built to kick in when it fails or times out. The actual actions inside here are exactly the same. I get the error message, I send an email, and I terminate as failed. The only difference in here is in the coalesce expression, and not really the coalesce really, it's in the result expression, because the result expression has to target a specific scope. So we actually need to pass the name of the scope into the result expression. So in this case, I handle get cocktails. In this case, I handle the process cocktail scope. Right, and if I run this, let's just check if this, so this should succeed, I guess. If I run this, it will just get me a recommendation on a random cocktail, like, right. Okay, I can actually make a kamikaze apparently. But I previously tested it with, let's say, yeah, it recommended me to go to the grocery store because I was missing something that I need to make a big bang shot, right? I didn't have any very overproof from. Right, if I'm forced this to fail in either of the steps, I'll just get the same email I've shown you already, so I won't really do that for the purpose of saving time. Right, and now the final thing I want to show you in here is is a case when you actually have to have loops. Now, as mentioned, we would try to avoid them, but well, in real life business scenarios, we might need to have loops in our flows. And when we do that, there are a few approaches we could take. Now, if for whatever reason you wanted your flow to stop on the first item failing in your loop, yeah, I don't really know why you would ever want that, but you never know. In my opinion, that doesn't really make sense. But if you wanted to have your flow failing and stopping on the first item that fails, you just need to have an exception scope individually added after the loop over here with the appropriate schema, which is slightly different from the one that we use for scopes. But we just individually handle the loop in here so that whenever a single item, a single action inside the loop fails, we kick in with the exception handling for it, and we terminate the flow at that point using the terminate action. But again, I don't really know a case where we would want to stop completely when an item in a loop fails. So yeah, in most cases, we would want the one item to be skipped or somehow updated in a way that it says that it's failed, whereas further items still get processed. And that's the usual case with loops. Again, when we go with that approach, we could also do two different things, where we could either push all of the contents of the loop into a child flow and just call it from within the loop and then do all of the handling inside the child flow, or we can just do everything inside the loop itself. Both approaches are perfectly valid, but I just, for the purpose of the demo, I didn't want to switch back and forth between two flows, so I just pushed everything in here. And what we do then is that we again have a scope inside the loop that has all of the actions of the loop itself, and then an exception scope over here that does whatever we want to do. If this was if we were actually processing items from a queue or from a SharePoint list or whatever, we'd be updating the item or whatever. In my case, I just get spammed with emails about items failing. But the important thing is that I don't terminate. I couldn't even if I wanted, because you can't put in and terminate action inside a loop. But that's the point. We don't actually terminate the flow inside the loop. We continue with the next item. Now but then again, we also still have a proper exception loop over here that will handle any of the other actions outside of the apply to each, because apply to each will still succeed if even if any of the single items fail, because the exception will be handled. It won't really kick in, with the exception scope over here. But if any of the other two actions fail, then this will actually run, and then it will send me an error message. So in this particular case, I'm actually running the cocktails that I'm just running a flow that will just get all of my favorite cocktails, and then I've got a loop that will loop through all of them and get all of the ingredients I need, check whether or not I have all of them, and then send me a list, a shorter list, in this case, a more useful list, that of all of the favorite cocktails that I could make based off what I've got. Right, so that takes a few more seconds than the normal one, but yeah, so I've got that over here, right? So I can still make quite a few, apparently. Got myself stocked properly. But if I were to, if I make this action fail, that's not really interesting. We'll just see the same message we've seen in the past. But if I were to make an action in here fail, for example, and I'll just, force it to fail by checking if, and this will obviously fail because tried is a column in the cocktails list and not the ingredients list. So what I'll get here is a bunch of emails spamming me. Yeah, so an item failed. Yeah, normally we wouldn't use emails on this, right? But that's what I did in this case. So what it does still have is the error message. I still get the flow run URL is simply because I set up the email the same way. You could do whatever you want. In most cases, in the expected enterprise scenario, all items wouldn't fail in a loop. I just forced that to happen because I put in an invalid filter in my get items action in there. So it made all of my items fail. In most cases, you would expect, one or two items failing within an array of others that are actually handled properly. Then I still get the actual email with the recommendation that, tells me that I can't really make any of my favorites. I would need to go to the grocery store and stock up. Right. That's pretty much that for the demo. And yeah, so I'll just switch back to my slides. And I have a few key takeaways to mention. Essentially, the best way to handle exceptions in Power Automate Cloud Flows is more or less following these bullets in there. So you should handle containers using the result expression and not individual actions. If possible, wrap the entire flow within a main, or whatever you call it, try, whatever's, a single scope, and then add another scope for the exception within that. Try to have minimum nesting. Try avoiding loops and conditions inside of scopes if possible. But if you do actually have to use nesting for whatever reasons, handle the exception at each container level, meaning that if you have a condition or a loop, sorry about that, if you have a condition or a loop inside your scope, handle the exception for the nested container inside the scope too, and then terminate or continue depending on your rules. I would recommend sending an email with the error details and the flow run link to whoever is responsible. That's usually a good idea. Probably not a very good idea to send emails on every item failing inside a loop, but at least when on an actual flow failing, that's usually quite useful. And I would absolutely recommend terminating as failed after handling, and that's and not using the finally scope as shown previously. These are the main expressions I used. The coalesce one for getting the details with all of the different schemas for the possible error messages. The one thing you might want to change in this one, if you use it, is the name of the scope. Again, you need to actually target it by using the name. So if your name is, if the scope is not named main, then you need to adjust that. But otherwise, this can actually be used. If you find any further schemas to actually, be valid and work, you just, you can just add them as extra, but as in a comma separated array. If you do actually find any valid schemas that cover something that these don't, drop me a message on LinkedIn. I'd like to be up to date on this one. And then there's this. This is the expression that gets you the flow run link. And you don't need to modify this one in any way. This works exactly the same on any environment, any tenant that you may have. So this is a pretty universal and quite cool expression. Right, and before we wrap up, there's one more thing I'd like to mention. Relatively recently came across a great article by Peter Veenstra on sharepains.com about a Dataverse table called flow run. This table should contain all flow run details, including the status of on whether the flow has actually succeeded or not, as well as even the error message when the actual flow fails. Unfortunately, this new feature, it is a new feature, and it's not actually live on all tenants. I personally do not have access to a tenant or an environment where the table is actually being populated. So I couldn't really show it to you in the demo, even though I really wanted to. The screenshot here is from Peter's article, actually, on sharepains.com. But the idea for this is that when it actually becomes generally available, we could technically have a single flow with a Dataverse trigger for entries into this table. And the single flow could just send us error details to us or resubmit the failed run or whatever. It would, in theory, allow us to avoid using scopes for error handling and building it into each of our flows. So essentially, we would be able to scrape all of the things I've just told you about. Of course, this would only apply to simple flows where we do not need the flow itself to recover from the error. Or we don't want to have loops, where we need individual items to be skipped an error, but other items still being processed. So, we still kind of need to use proper exception handling in more complex flows. But this simplifies it for the simple flow. It could still easily make our lives easier for most of them. It could also allow environment admins, for example, to get notified on flows built by citizen developers who perhaps have no idea how to build exception handling, or it would just be used for getting some statistics on runs in general. Quite a few applications for this, in my opinion. So it's something worth to look forward to. Right, and that's pretty much all there is. This is the time we can do some Q&A. I guess we have some time for that. Before we start that, there's a QR code over here to connect with me on LinkedIn, or you can find me via this link as well if you want to. Drop me a connection request. And I would really appreciate it if you took a couple of minutes to actually rate my session by following the link behind this QR code. Because I'm an aspiring speaker. I haven't done this for a very long time, and this is one of the first times I'm actually delivering this particular session. So any constructive feedback you may have, whether positive or negative, would really help me improve. So I'd really appreciate that. Now is the actual time for Q&A.
Awesome, thank you. That was brilliant. There are a couple of questions and comments in the Q&A. If you want to have a little dig through.
Yeah, okay, I'll just check that out. I'll keep the screen on just for a sec if you are actually connecting with me or something. Right, so there's one asking, anyone aware whether Microsoft is working on a more comprehensive error handling framework for Power Automate? As far as I know, no. And I'm sorry to say that, but I don't think they are. I haven't heard of any of that. I've spoken to Microsoft people about it, and yeah, they're not really positive about it. Some Microsoft people have attended my sessions on error handling where I roast them about not having proper error handling in native, and they're just like, okay, yeah, well, that's how it is. So unfortunately, that's probably not going to happen in the foreseeable future. We need to build in the framework ourselves whenever we build flows. Right. Yeah, Michal is sharing a good idea for posting error logs in Teams channel. That's also a good idea. I usually use email, but that, that's also valid, perfectly fine. Thanks for sharing. Right. Right, and yeah, Michal again. The having it in a child flow, having the actual exception handling in a child flow is, yeah, I've actually had the same question asked, and it's a great question. I've had that in Germany a couple of weeks ago. So yes, I have actually considered it. It could potentially work. It depends a bit. If you have several flows and you want all of them to be handled the same way, then it might make sense to put all those actions, the exception part, the part that it was in the exception scope, where I get the error, and then I get the, I send an email or whatever, and then, terminate wouldn't really work. But that, where we could just essentially move the two actions out into a child flow, and that would definitely work when we have all of our flows and we want them, to be handled the same way. But as soon as we've got any kind of custom handling, or such as updating an item in a queue or a list, or or things like that, that would not really work with a child flow, at least. Well, we would still need several of them, I guess. So that depends a bit. If you've got lots of flows and you want to handle all of them the same way, then it might make sense.
I have one comment to this, if I may.
Yeah, sure.
Because sometimes error handling is not only the email or notification. Sometimes we need some kind of a log, error log, and you have an extra. It might be an extra one task or a few tasks where you are putting aside some extra information about the flow and the conditions or some variables which has been registered. So this might in return be a good idea to use a child flow. But my question was, do you have an experience? Have you tried it already?
Yeah, and it does. Well, it depends a bit, because you still kind of need to capture the error itself in the flow where the error happens, because it's the result of a scope will not be accessible from a child flow, because when the scope actually runs, well, all of the actions within the scope, they run in a parent flow, and their outputs are not by default accessible to a child flow. So we would still need to use whatever expression we use to actually capture the error in the parent, and we would also need to keep the terminate action in the parent. But whatever we do with the error message, whether we log it in some system or something, could definitely be moved out to a child flow. And it does make sense if the logging functionality is complex, or actually consists of several actions, and when you've got several flows that actually need to be handled the same way. So if those logs actually need to be done the same way for your flows, and if they're more than a single action to actually do it, then it does make a lot of sense, and it's definitely possible. In my case, it would have just essentially meant moving the send an email action out into a child flow, so it didn't really make much sense.
Thank you. Super. Thank you. And nice session, by the way.
Thanks.
There are some comments, questions attached to that particular question in the comments. If you open that up.
So more than one.
Did I make sense then?
Yeah, I can see them. I was actually, I had expanded it. I hadn't read it though. Yeah, importing these cloud flows from one. Yeah, well, when it comes to importing cloud flows from an environment to another environment, yes, it's the same. I don't see why it shouldn't be. It works perfectly fine, whether or not we have it, because a child flow is actually called by a parent, and it should be technically the same. If we were to, I guess the only issue would potentially be with any connections used in the actual logging handling functionality, but those should be fine. If we were using this flow run table in Dataverse, that could potentially maybe cause issues when navigating to a new environment. If we were using a child flow or a single cloud flow to handle everything within an environment, we actually target a specific table. I haven't tried it, obviously, because it's not being populated in my tenants, but I would assume that the table has a different ID in the different environments. So we would probably need to configure the triggers accordingly, but maybe not, might actually work, needs to be tested. Other than that, it's perfectly fine.
Yeah, I think if you include your cloud flows in the solution and then transport them via a solution, use the Dataverse current environment connector, then it just adjusts to whatever the target environment is.
Yeah, well, exactly. I think it should just essentially work perfectly fine while moving between environments. as long as we have all of the connections actually used, then it should be fine. Yeah. I don't see any further questions, really, just a couple of comments.
There's just one more at the top from Harsh. Yeah, if you scroll right up to the top just now.
Okay. If the try failed, catch will run, right? Yes, but in case of catch failed and we want to send, right? Obviously, if your catch fails, then you kind of are in trouble. You would then need to either have extra exception handling for the catch, which just, you know, could potentially pile up to lots and lots of exception handling. Having a child flow might actually be slightly better in this case, but or this flow tracking the flow run table, that could potentially also work. But essentially, you would want to try to make your catch as simple as possible, so that it's as unlikely as possible to actually fail. But obviously it can fail, and then, you know, you're just out of luck essentially. But yeah, I would in that case try to, you know, try to have this extra flow do the handling for me, you know, where when the flow run table actually becomes available, I'd want to have it at least reporting, or potentially maybe resubmitting or something, but at the very least reporting on any flows where catch actually fails. Or if we just, you know, kind of outsource, in a sense, the whole handling part into a child flow, then, you know, the child flow's body becomes the catch part of the parent. So we can just put in another different catch in there to handle that in a more simple way, if I'm making sense. But the idea is that if your actions, for example, in my case, if I were sending an email and if I move that to a child flow and my send an email action fails, I would, in the child flow, I would have an extra step that does something else in that case, like, you know, logging it somewhere that's less likely to fail than sending an email, something like that, essentially. So in this case, if you're risking that your catch actually can fail, it might make a lot of sense to move your catch into a child flow.
Okay, fab. Well, that was brilliant. Thank you. Punctual as well. I like that. But yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks, Parva, especially you for keeping your camera on the whole time.
Right.
Always nice to see you.
Nice to see you, mate.
It's a really good session. Thank you.
That's
Yeah,
great.
well,
Thank you very much.
thanks for joining, and thanks for having me, Sarah, again. And I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any feedback, again, I'd appreciate it if you submitted it via the form I shared, or, you know, drop me a message on LinkedIn or something like that. Thanks.
Awesome.
Great
Thanks.
session.
Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Have a
Thank
good
you.
evening.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.